Parashat Masei, we read of the mitzvah to create Arei Miklat and the requirement for somebody who is found guilty of involuntary manslaughter to run to one of these cities of refuge and to remain there. And one of the curious elements of this parsha, which has perplexed Chazal from the very beginning, is that the release of this Rotzeach from the Arei Miklat is dependent on the death of the Kohen Gadol. And so for generations we've struggled with this question of what exactly the connection between these two things are. And it would seem on the face of it that the discussion really falls into a almost classic chakira of the simon or siba. Is the death of the Kohen Gadol the reason why the Rotzeach can now go free, or is the death of the Rotzeach simply a reflection of some other process that has been happening? And it seems that the Gemara itself takes up this question in Makos Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, where it asks the question straight out: is it Misas HaKohen, which is Mechaper, or is it the Galus, which is Mechaper? And the Gemara comes to the conclusion that it is in fact the Misas HaKohen, it is the death of the Kohen Gadol, which provides atonement for the Rotzeach. There in the Gemara, the reason offered seems to be related to a failure in leadership on behalf of the Kohen Gadol, that had he davened more, had he been more sensitive to the needs of the generation, things like this wouldn't have happened. And so the death of the Kohen Gadol is necessary to fully atone for the sin that seems to have occurred. Tosfos already on the page remarks that this can't be the whole story, because earlier in Makos there seems to be a strong suggestion that in fact it is the Galus which is Mechaper. And so Tosfos offers his own answer. He says that in fact the death of the Kohen Gadol is poter one from the kapara necessary through Galus. But it is not that the Misa of the Kohen Gadol is Mechaper, the Avon itself. The Rambam seems to take this even a little bit further. The Rambam several times in Hilchos Rotzeach, Shmiras HaNefesh, says that quite explicitly refers to Galus as the act which is Mechaper, which seems to work well with what he writes in Moreh Nevuchim, where he describes the death of the Kohen Gadol as a very natural phenomenon, and says in fact the linkage between the two has nothing to do with kapara necessarily. It actually is a reflection of the fact that once the Kohen Gadol dies and the entire nation is subsumed in the mourning and grief over the loss of the Kohen Gadol, it naturally lowers the temperature on people's personal tragedies, so that the Goel Hadam now isn't necessarily as passionately committed to getting retribution and vengeance from the person who killed their family member, because they're subsumed in the grief of others. And so the Misa of the Kohen Gadol is a sign that it is now safe for the Rotzeach to leave. What is fascinating, though, is that the Yerushalmi seems to take this in a different direction. The Yerushalmi writes that, in fact, the death of the person in this case, the act of Ritzicha B'Shogeg, is one of two sins which actually had no kapara at all. The Yerushalmi writes as follows: "Of Simon b'Shem Rabbi Yonasan the Beis Govrin Shnei Dvarim Lo Haisa Bahen Kapara V'Kava Lahen HaTorah Kapara." There were two things which had no kapara at all, and then after the fact, the Torah gives them a way of atoning. The Eloheina Omer Lashon Hara, the Hahoreg Nefesh Bishgaga. The two are somebody who says Lashon Hara and somebody who inadvertently kills. And then the Yerushalmi continues and says, so what was the atonement that was offered? Well, for Lashon Hara, it was the bells on the me'il of the Kohen Gadol, whose voice, whose sound was, the kol was holich v'shomea. People could hear those bells going at a distance. And then the atonement for the Horeg Nefesh Bishgaga was the Misa of the Kohen Gadol. So in this version, one still has to ask the question of what is the connection between the Misa of the Kohen Gadol and the Rotzeach Bishgaga, but we begin to gain insight by seeing the parallel that the Yerushalmi has drawn. So what is the parallel between Lashon Hara and Hahoreg Nefesh Bishgaga? And I want to suggest that perhaps the following is the connection between the two. The reason why there is no kapara for Lashon Hara is because the value of the damage can't be estimated. The kol is holech, right? It goes. You have no idea who said what to whom. Once you've put it out there, it's impossible to get back. And so doing kapara for something where we don't know exactly what we did or what the extent of the damage is extremely difficult. There is no kapara, says the Yerushalmi. But yet there needs to be some way out. And so what does the Torah do? It creates a symbolic act which will ultimately create kapara, because there's a lesson to be learned. And so if a person can learn the lesson, then kapara can be attained. What is the lesson? The lesson is just like the sound of the bells. Go, and people hear, and you have no idea who did hear, who didn't hear. So too, the same is true about Lashon Hara, and that is why one symbolically can offer kapara for the other. And I think the same thing is true with the Misa of a Kohen Gadol. What is the problem? Why is there no kapara for somebody who's horeg nefesh b'shgaga? Because we can't estimate the value. Who knows the damage that you've done by taking a life, even if it was inadvertent? And here we're not just talking about the pain that happens to the family members, but we're talking about what this life could have done, the good it could have done, the people who it could have saved, the bounty it could have brought to a family, the incredible mitzvos and tzedakah that this person could have done over a lifetime. All of it is gone. You can't begin to estimate what that actually was. And so, says the Yerushalmi, it's connected to something which is symbolic, something which reminds us, right, of this lesson, the death of the Kohen Gadol. Somebody whose job was to do good on behalf of the Jewish people, to serve the Jewish people. We have no idea what they could have continued to do had they continued to live. And so we see in the Bavli and in our Rishonim and Achronim, it seems to be the question is whether the Misa of the Kohen Gadol is in fact mechaper, or it reflects some sort of natural process which is happening. And the Yerushalmi, it seems to be there to teach us a lesson. The idea that we cannot begin to estimate the value of a human life. Good job.